we're sitting with this little bijou argument amongst ourselves about whether we should or shouldn't. And meanwhile, streaming past us in billions of dollars worth of investment are the applications to human medicine, human health, and to agriculture. And those are open to the natural world.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we make the case for conserving nature and its biodiversity by building a robust, credible argument, one that sometimes requires us to examine conventional wisdom. I'm your host, Andre Marder. Synthetic biology, the engineering of life at the genetic level, is advancing at pace. Much of the public conversation fixates on de-extinction and charismatic creatures like woolly mammoths, dire wolves, and moas. But is that really what matters in this new world that we're looking at? And while we debate whether these technologies should be applied to the natural world at all, massive investment in human medicine and agriculture is already releasing genetically modified organisms into open systems, including soils, freshwater, oceans, and even our own bodies. Synthetic biology also raises difficult questions about who benefits, who bears the costs, and what it means when private intellectual property becomes embedded in the genome of an endangered species. To explore all of this, I spoke with returning guests to the show, Kent Redford, a conservation scientist who spent well over a decade trying to bring synthetic biology to the attention of conservationists. We discussed the blurry line between genetic engineering and synthetic biology, the promise and peril of engineered gene drives, and why he believes the field's obsession with de-extinction is largely a waste of time. Kent also makes a deeper, more unsettling argument. The conservation is gripped by a kind of Holocene hubris, still trying to restore a past that's already slipping away. I began by asking Kent to talk about the difference between synthetic biology and something similar and perhaps more familiar to most of us, genetic engineering.
So I don't think there is a big difference. I think it's not a difference in content or structure, it's a difference in technique and tools. Because really what we're talking about is altering the genetic level of biodiversity to achieve desired human outcomes in an engineered fashion. And there have been versions of this that have been going on for a long time. Initially, it was done by firing silver pellets at genomes, and then it was done using radiation to bring about massive changes, and then you'd sort through and find the ones you like. And then, of course, earliest on was domestication, which was your sheep had babies and you liked the looks of one of them, and the other ones you ate, and that one grew up and passed on her characteristics. And the difference between that domestication pattern and these more modern techniques is one, the purposefulness of it, the engineering nature, and the speed with which it takes place. So
Mm-hmm.
domestication took place over thousands of years in a linked socio-ecological context. It didn't take place in a university lab or a startup lab somewhere over a period of years or perhaps decades.
Mm-hmm.
So the concern about the spread of changes induced by human-driven genetic changes has been going on for a while. One could argue that in alien invasive species, although a problematic term, is a good description for the kinds of concerns that people have with the deployment of these technologies out in the quote natural world. And I think it has some validity, although it serves as a stalking horse, in my opinion, for many of the concerns people really have.
Right. Just to kind of dig a little bit more at that distinction, and I understand that it's sort of maybe distinction is even the wrong word, but as far as I understand, I mean, genetic engineering is kind of like a tool or a component, I suppose you could say, of synthetic biology. But synthetic biology it goes far beyond, right? It's not just about altering genes or altering an individual gene. It's about, creating entirely new systems in an ever more complex way.
No, not really, in the sense that the objectives are the same. the tools and the ambition increase lockstep with one another. So when you can do something, you think maybe I should do it. Just for example, the news, at least here in the US, in this last week of a precision genetic altering of human embryos. I mean, so that is the kind of thing that is now able to be done given the sophistication of the tools. I think people would, people who were proponents of eugenics, and I don't equate these two, would have been wanting to do that centuries ago if they could
If
have.
they could, yeah.
So, I mean, genetic engineering is really a precursor of synthetic biology. And it's worth pointing out that there is no universally or internationally agreed upon definition for the term synthetic biology, which reflects the fact that people have different views on this. To me, it is best summed up by the fact that biology is being taken over by engineers. And one of the founders of synthetic biology said that evolution is a 2 billion-year-old piece of software that desperately needs updating.
Hmm.
And that's really, it's kind of that approach. Okay, fine. Biology is very inefficient. We can be much more efficient. So excuse me, move over. You guys haven't been very good at it, and we'll take over. And so with computer simulation and now with powered by AI and with the tools available, the engineers are taking over biology.
What do you mean by efficient in that context? So evolution has been inefficient. I guess you mean it's a very slow process, whereas with this kind of technology, things can be fast-tracked by orders of magnitude, right?
Well, yes, and also the very nature of natural selection, it requires variation, and that variation and it being acted upon by natural selection perforce means that there are a lot of things that don't thrive well under natural selection
Hmm.
and which die. So that's, as far as an engineer is concerned, is a waste, is inefficiency. I mean, if I can produce the thing you want without any deaths, why wouldn't you want that? We don't need to go through all of this. Oh man, that's almost nice. Or, you want to eat a few of your sheep, but really, if you want better wool, just step aside and I'll go give you better wool.
Hmm. And I guess the kind of overarching or underlying fear is just as it was with genetic engineering is the lack of control element, right? That this process will kind of run away from those who instigated it. Is that a correct understanding? That's sort of the main reason why not just conservationists, but I guess anyone who's concerned about this technology and might not understand necessarily how it works.
Well, no, I don't think there is a main worry. I think there's a basket of worries. And so, in addition to the one you just laid out, the question of who is doing this, who benefits and who pays the costs is a prominent concern. The question of, which is in many ways related to that, is what happens when for-profit companies step into biology? And a colleague of mine raised the really interesting kind of thought experiment. There is an interest in engineering black-footed ferrets, which is this small ferret-like animal that lives in the arid parts of the Western North America, very endangered. And the thing that kills it particularly is plague, which kills the prairie dogs, a disease passed through fleas, but it also kills black-footed ferrets. So if you could engineer black-footed ferrets to be resistant to plague, that'd be a great thing. But if the genetic changes that were effected that allowed black-footed ferrets, an endangered species, to be resistant to plague were copyrighted, trademarked by a private company, what does that mean to have an endangered species with private intellectual property embedded within its genome and, in fact, essential for the long-term survival of that?
Mm.
So those are the kinds of questions, head-scratching questions. And given certainly in the US, the abandon with which we have turned over the controls of our lives to wealthy individuals, causes a significant amount of concern about what this would mean for the natural world.
Just to quickly zoom in on that particular example, I guess it depends on the legal structures of a country. But in the US, for example, is that actually possible that a corporation can you see the pathway that they would follow to claim ownership of a species?
Well, you look at the actions of Colossal,
Mm,
which is a private company, and what it is proposing and has done, for example, in its claim to have, quote, remade dire wolves. No, there is the patent. I'm not a patent lawyer. I don't even really know what that means, except that we do not have patent law that would give a clear answer to that.
mm,
But so it will be contested in court. And again, in this country, given the politics, the rights of private business are superseding certainly the public interest. So I would be very concerned about how that would move forward under the current political climate in the US.
hmm. You know, the last time we spoke, you mentioned a friend of yours who was a tiger conservationist who said that he wasn't interested in synthetic biology,
Mm.
essentially because you couldn't guarantee him that, that this discussion about synthetic biology would help him to conserve tigers, right? But maybe it's good to just talk a little bit about what the opportunities are in terms of conservation when it comes to synthetic biology. And I guess accompanying that would be the concerns as well. You've already touched on a couple of them, but I understand that there are quite a few. There are quite a few ways in which this tool could be used for conservation in pretty incredible ways. But there are also, as you said, a basket of concerns. Could you just kind of go into a few more of those?
Sure. And it will require a short digression into one of my new passions, which is the microbial world.
Hmm.
The conservation community has been drawn to the question of de-extinction as the application of synthetic biology on which everyone wants to focus. And that focus has been ramped up, amplified by the obsession of the journalistic community on that topic. And so, if I have to hear one more reference to Jurassic Park and to Jeff Goldblum and Life Will Succeed and whether or not these white puppy wolves are in fact dire wolves, whether or not moas can be recreated, whether or not dinosaurs can be recreated, whether or not we can bring woolly mammoths back, you know, I think that's a complete waste of time, in my opinion, a complete waste of time, because what is happening to the natural world will not be solved or even particularly addressed by successes in any of those fields. What excites me is the potential applications to microbes. And there's a Spanish biologist named Ricard Soler who has been writing and doing experiments on soil crusts. Now, in very arid environments, if any of your listeners have been there, it's not infrequent if you go out and walk in that area, you'll crunch.
Hmm.
Your foot will crunch as it steps on the soil. What it's crunching through is a soil crust that's made of a combination of bacteria and fungi and a few other things that are effectively putting a seal on that loose soil. They absorb water, they create nutrients. They are a very important source of potential stabilizing effects on wind-blown erosion
Hmm.
and the possibility for restoration, etc. So what Soleil and his colleagues are doing is proposing and experimenting on modifying some of the bacterial components of those soil crusts to increase their ability to absorb moisture, thereby making it available to the soil and the soil microorganisms and potential plant seeds and all the rest of it. Now we're talking. I mean, now we're talking about something that's really important. Those hyperarid environments cover some third of the Earth's surface. If we can do something about improving the lot of those areas, that to me is an enormously important topic.
Hmm.
Or this phenomenal person named Raquel Peixoto, who is working in Saudi Arabia on the potential to apply probiotics to corals to increase their ability to survive in warming and acidifying ocean waters. Now we're talking because coral reefs, are not only extremely important for biodiversity, but are the basis on which many, many, many millions of poor people rely for subsistence. So that to me is the kind of place where the conservation community should be talking about synthetic biology and whether it's good or it's bad and who decides and all the rest of it, not on woolly mammoths and moas and even passenger pigeons, no
Hmm.
matter how much I love them.
Well, those examples are two things. Number one, they're much more possible, or they are possible, right? And number two, they're useful. I guess those are the two key ways in which they differ from recreating a woolly mammoth.
Well, I find the word useful to be problematic in the sense that it demands the question of to whom.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, the argument is made that, for example, that some of this de-extinction stuff, the woolly mammoths might restore functionality to the northern tundras and increase carbon sequestration, and others have said this is really about inspiring younger people to see hope in a world of no hope. But so useful is a relative term. I
Sure.
mean, I think so. I think that it has potential higher return for the natural world and for the human inhabitants than the de-extinction when focused on charismatic vertebrates.
Hmm. Obviously, over the years, as the technology improves, the degree to which we can affect these changes to species and ecosystems is growing, right? The capability is just growing all the time. So with the capability also grows for lack of a better word, the temptation to use these in various different
Yeah, the
ways.
potential applications.
Let's say
Mhm.
that, yeah. So there's more pressure on conservation to use these technologies, right?
Well, yes, but those potential and actual applications will not be taking place in conservation. They'll be taking place in human medicine and in agriculture, which are just running away with these technologies. So we're sitting with this little bijou argument amongst ourselves about whether we should or shouldn't. And meanwhile, streaming past us in billions of dollars worth of investment are the applications to human medicine, human health, and to agriculture.
Hmm.
And those are open to the natural world. So in the case of agriculture, obviously, sort of the relationship between agricultural fields and the rest of nature means that they're open systems with permeability. And even though people don't think about our own bodies as ecosystems, they are. And so we have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of species and microbes that live in and on us. And so if you ingest a probiotic, which contains genetically altered genomes, then when you excrete through defecating or urinating, those things are entering the sewer systems, which are then passing through water treatment plants, if you're lucky, and then into freshwater systems and then into the ocean. So we are open systems for these things that are being proposed, yet we're thought of as closed. Well, no, I mean that's just human medicine, so it's not relevant to ecology.
Mm.
And the data, for example, on the extent to which pharmaceuticals as well as recreational drugs are impacting natural freshwater systems after having been flushed down toilets is really remarkable.
Mm.
So we're already releasing genetically modified organisms through these various techniques, and yet we're engaged in this argument about no, you should, yes, you should,
Mm.
which is just, I may have said before, it's like a 3-year-old kid who puts their hands over their eyes and says, "You can't see me." I mean,
Mm.
that's the kind of self-centered view that's not getting us very far.
But just to play devil's advocate, I can imagine the hardcore conservationists responding to that with something like, well, that means that we need to tighten regulations. That means that we need to try even harder to, get other ministries to listen to the Ministry of Environment when they try to put down their regulations, rather than this is a tool that we should also use.
Well, the answer is good luck. Number one, when you start being able to cure human cancers and improve human nutrition, and when you start to be able to produce more food in a better quality food with lower environmental costs, the conservation committee will be in the position it's always been in, which is, excuse me, you're not relevant to us. You don't count, you don't vote, you don't have a big budget, etc.
Yeah.
So no, and there are some of the efforts, for example, that's being tried in agriculture is to increase nitrogen fixation by plants so that you can dramatically decrease the application of nitrogen fertilizers, which are hugely responsible through runoff for affecting dead zones in ocean systems.
Mm.
So who wouldn't want that? If that could happen without some unknown knock-on effect.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's maybe one of the strongest arguments for genetic engineering, even before synthetic biology became a thing, was that using this technology can actually reduce the amount of pollution or other bad things. It's like genetic engineering was considered one bad thing, but it was helping to alleviate other bad things, and therefore maybe it was worthwhile considering.
So there is a lot of interest in genetically modifying microorganisms to be able to restore environments and to decrease pollution loads.
Mhm.
So oil spills in marine settings, trinitrotoluene, TNT, remnants left in soils, a lot of these things, mine tailings, toxic chemicals coming out of mine tailings. We don't have any ways to deal with that. So there are some potential really positive ways of doing that if they were to work and if they didn't have these concerning potential possible knock-on impacts.
Mhm. One of the apparently most contentious kind of aspects or elements of synthetic biology is gene drives, which I don't understand in any great detail, but as far as I understand, it's genetic engineering or synthetic biology, which affects generations. So, for example, treating a mosquito in some or other way so that offspring, how does it work again? Where that's some or other. I think mosquitoes is probably a bad example, but some or other
No,
trait
it's
gets.
not.
Uh,
First place, I think it's really important to say engineered gene drives because gene drives are naturally occurring
uh,
within life on Earth. And so humans are not proposing to invent something brand new. We're proposing to purpose something that already exists to achieve goals that we lay out ahead of time. And in short, a gene drive is a way of ensuring the transmission of a given genetic trait without worrying about losing it in the course of sexual reproduction.
mhm,
So, because you get half your genes from the female and half your genes from the male, so you're going to lose, you're gradually diluting it if you're not trying to force that genetic modification through. So, this is a way of harnessing the modification to a genetic element to ensure that it goes to all of the offspring of a given female.
mm,
So, again, that not surprisingly got created through an evolutionary process on its own. And we're just engineering ways of trying to do that. So in the case of the mosquito, what you're trying to do is engineer in the mosquito, and there are a variety of different targets. One of them is to make them so they're not suitable hosts for the falciparum malaria, which causes the malaria.
mhm,
Another possibility is to make sure that all females only produce male offspring and males generally don't bite, and there are no females to mate, and so gradually you would cause extinction of that population through the effect of gene drive.
uh-huh,
Now, there are lots of concerns about that. An enormous amount of experimentation is going on with that. One of the ones that I'm familiar with that's furthest along has to do with mice because on oceanic islands, which are frequently places which have been havens for seabirds to nest. These mice have gotten there largely through human intervention, and they're now major predators on chicks and eggs.
Mm.
And they're being treated with really nasty poisons like warfarin, which cause painful deaths, but are very effective at killing rodents. And so what is being tested is whether or not you could develop a gene drive from mice, which would cause them to produce only male offspring.
Mm.
And so you would be avoiding painful deaths. You would eventually, through the course of generations, lose the mice as predators on the islands.
Mm.
And, so, okay, so there's a big problem that's been raised. So house mice, which are invasive most places, are native in Europe. So the concern is, well, one of these mice with these gene drives would get back to Europe, and all of a
Mm.
sudden you'd lose an important element of the native fauna of a large part of the earth. So the positives, the negatives, the concerns, and that's the work, some of the work that's been going on, but it's been going on with a variety of other taxa as well.
Hmm. That's sort of, I don't know if contamination is the right word to use in that example, but that's kind of what I had in mind, I guess, earlier on when I was referring to that. I mean, what is the fix in a case like that when, you have to contain the effect of the genetic engineering that you've done? Have there been methods of terminating it at a certain point that that sort of peters out over a few generations or something like that? Is that a possibility?
There's a lot of experimentation with it. I'm kind of 5 years out of date on it, but at that time, one of the principal foci was to look for genetic variations that are unique to the population of house mice on a given island,
Uh-huh.
because it's the founder effect, it's called. When
Mm.
there's a very small number of animals that start a population, you tend to get differences in that population from much larger populations. So if on each island you could find a genetic variant that was only on that island, and you could tie your gene drive to that, then if that mouse got off, you wouldn't have, in theory, the transmission of the gene drive
Mm.
because you didn't have that genetic variant.
Right. And I guess what this points to is just the need for extremely careful regulation of these technologies, right? Because some of them are kind of almost no-brainers in terms of solving problems, and others, have very clear potential repercussions, like the mouse one that you just mentioned now. So I suppose that's why this is being discussed in the CBD, for example.
No, that's right. And, I don't know whether your listeners would be aware of the guerrilla restoration work that's been going on in the UK with, for example, beavers. So you have all these regulation about where beavers can be reintroduced, but then you have a set of people who are getting their pet beavers and taking them out any old where. So you can have the regulations all you want, but you have to be thinking there may be somebody who purposefully or accidentally ended up with a mouse in her luggage and off it goes.
Yeah. And I think, throughout everything that you've said now, I keep on hearing words that I've heard you say before, which is that, you know, whether you like it or not, this is coming. It's already here. So we either let it pass us by, or we harness it to the best of our abilities. And I guess there's an argument to be made for, I mean, apart from just taking the opportunity, if you don't try to harness something, generally speaking, then you're more likely to lose control of it, right? I mean, kind of almost by definition. So, the more of a grip that we have on how to use this technology, the more likely we are to use it in a positive way.
Well, right. And I wouldn't quite put it that way. What I would say is that, as I made reference earlier, the absurdity of the conservation community arguing about whether or not these technologies should be applied or not
Mm.
is just that, an absurdity, because they are being applied. And they're being applied in settings, as we discussed, in the natural world.
Mm.
So, one of the resolutions that was voted on in the last World Conservation Congress was for a global moratorium on the application of synthetic biology to, quote, natural systems. Well, fine. I mean, it got defeated, but let's say it got approved. Yeah, I mean, who's going to do that? First, IUCN can't make anybody do anything, and it's already going on anyway. So maybe a set of people would go to bed with a satisfied smile on their face, but it would be a Pyrrhic victory because you just have to wake up the next morning and realize that that was a pointless exercise.
Hmm. Maybe good to move on to another question now, which is the kind of broader, maybe philosophical question about what synthetic biology means for what we think of nature as being and what we think of conservation as being. Because, I mean, I think you and others like Earl Ellis, for example, have made the argument that, we've been impacting the planet for millennia already. This is just the latest way in which we're doing it, and it is perhaps a more it's a vastly accelerated and increased way of doing it, but it is kind of a continuation of us changing nature. So, how would you say, like, what does this mean for our assumptions, our deeper assumptions about what nature even is?
Yeah. Okay. First, I want to talk about counterfactuals.
Hmm.
And Andre, you know what counterfactuals are, yeah?
Hmm.
So most people don't.
Hmm.
And I think there's something innate to human evolution that thinks a counterfactual is a waste of time. But basically the question being, we always ask, if you do something, what will the impact be?
Hmm.
The counterfactual is, if you don't do something, what will the outcome be? And so the comparison should be between the outcome of when you do something and the outcome of when you don't do something, rather than just the outcome of doing something.
Hmm.
And this, I can't tell you the hundreds of people who've just looked at me with a blank look when I try to get them to think about that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and as I say, I just think probably in human evolution, that was a waste of time. I'm going to try eating this berry, and if I die in front of you, well, you'll know not to eat it. And so, anyway, off we went. So, for me, one of the key questions about the applications of synthetic biology to the quote natural world is what's happening to the natural world if we don't apply synthetic biology?
Hmm.
That's the world we're living in. And in short, it's going to hell. The global change, with the most significant component being human-caused climate change, but also human movement, both due to stress like war and famine, but also through choice, the urbanization, pollution, disease, all of these things are changing the natural world. Even if you don't accept Ellis and colleagues' view that basically the majority of the world has been changed by humans over the last 12,000 years anyway. So that's one point. Second point is the majority of human evolution, human cultural evolution, has happened in the last 10,000 years during the Holocene, which is uncharacteristic of the majority of the length of climate change on Earth. It's been an uncharacteristically stable climate, which has really allowed the domestication of crops and animals and the spread of urbanization and the development of cultures and technologies and all the rest of it. We're rapidly exiting the Holocene. And yet we are suffering. I'm trying to decide whether it's best called Holocene hubris or Holocene hallucinations. We still are acting as if through our actions we can return the natural world to the state it was in the Holocene.
Hmm.
Well, that state's gone, or it's rapidly going. And so we are conservatives in the most visceral response, we being the conservation community,
Hmm.
in wanting to make things be the way they were when we were children. And we don't want to give that up. And I think the most important cultural change that has to take place amongst my community is kind of Buddhist opening up the hand, breathing out, and talk about what it is that we can do to try to make the near future as rich in leaving as much of the richness in the natural world as possible. To me,
Hmm.
that's it. That is not, that is not a common point of view.
Mm.
We are left doing what our teachers taught us, who are doing what their teachers taught us, and not responding to this change. So the natural world is going to hell only if you think about it in the context of how it was 100 or 200 or 500 years ago. And I have a colleague, Jedediah Brody, who's writing up a review about climate change with big old trees and how many generations it's been since they underwent really significantly different climates. And in some cases, it's, tens of generations. It's not that long. So maybe trees are going, oh, geez, wow. I heard from my great grandmother about that climate. Here it comes. And we're busy saying, oh my God, the world is over. That tree's going to die and it's all going to go to
Mm.
hell. And we can't, I mean, we can be screaming into our graves. I don't, there are these things called lacrimaria. They're little tiny glass vessels that were made to collect the tears of mourners at graveside, which would then be sealed and placed into the grave to allow the deceased individual to understand how much she was being missed. And you find collections of them. They're beautiful little things. Um, and there, professional mourners were hired to come to funerals who were good at crying and then collecting the tears so you could show how many lacrimae were buried with your mother or your sister. And I worry that we have turned ourselves into professional mourners for the nature that was, instead of trying to actively help include this richness for the nature that will be.
It reminds me also of the tendency, and I think this is also among conservationists and maybe environmentalists generally, and it's pretty much exactly what you're talking about, I think, this idea of utopia, heading towards or wanting to head towards a perfect world, rather than, as you say, this counterfactual, comparing what you do if you do one thing compared to what you do if you do another thing, or if you don't do anything at all. But it is remarkable that it escapes most people to consider that. I'm tempted to ask you why you think that is.
I think it's very scary to people. And I think we always find it easier to operate in a space in which we feel comfortable.
Mm,
And comfort comes about through lack of fear. So we are looking for places where we're not scared. And these visions of a prelapsarian past are deeply embedded in us. And
mm,
I just, I've been reading some of this monster studies, which turns out to be an extremely amazing subdiscipline. And in that, this one author talked about one of the facts that's not well understood, which is that God put in place a demon, an angel, to guard the Garden of Eden so that Adam and Eve could not go back in. Whoever talks about that? I mean, right? Why didn't they turn around and go, hell with this? Let's go back in there. No, that gate was guarded by a
mm,
monster.
mm,
And, and not that I think there's a monster guarding the gate, except maybe it's our own selves
mm,
of going back to this prelapsarian past. But whether it's guarded or not, we're not going there.
mhm,
So that to me, my interest in synthetic biology is not because I care about synthetic biology. It's
mm,
because I care about the kind of new tools that we need to put into place to consider using to try to increase or keep as much of nature's richness as we can.
mhm. What do you make, and I think I know what your answer is going to be to this, but perhaps as a final question, what do you make of the retort against synthetic biology that in conservation, that it's a sort of a distraction from the more urgent and important conservation that needs to happen?
Yeah. To some extent, I already answered it with that diatribe. Um, ought to happen is defined by many people using old views about it. So restoration, for all the importance that it is as in a general sort of center mass of the action, is about restoring things. That's why it's called restoration, which is a notion that there is a past to which we can return if we only are good enough. And as you've heard in this argument, I don't think that's true. So we're having a meeting in September to try to flesh out the concept of future conservation value. That is, what are the areas that are not currently highly important, but will be? I mean, so to me, that's the kind of forward-looking action we need to be taking. So distraction. One person's distraction is somebody else's alert to a changing future. So, when I first got into this, wanting to talk to to synthetic biologists and introduce them to conservationists, was at a meeting we organized in 2013 in the UK. And my own measure of success was I did not want my community to be able to say they'd never heard of this field. I'm not going to tell them what they need to think about it, but they need to think about it. And so here we are 13 years later, and there are a lot more people who are thinking about it. And if they don't like it, that's okay. If they've thought carefully about it and come to a conclusion, that's what I want. Because to me, the conclusion is going to be inevitable. We're going to be chipping away at the edges of this. We're going to have to admit that the world will be largely okay without a lot of the species of mammals and birds we care the most about, and I include myself in that. But it's not going to be okay without microbes. And it's not going to be okay without insects and earthworms and ants and termites and things like that. So, my field is not going to turn there rapidly because that isn't where the public support is. But that's what's important. So, do I view it as a distraction? No, not at all. I think it's a very important additional stream that needs to have more and more effort pushed towards it. It's like a braided river, right? And so the parts of the river that are following the pandas and grizzlies should be diminished, and the part that's looking more at some of the rest of these things we've talked about is going to increase in flow. And I think if people start thinking about these things, they may be reconsidering some of their views about genetic modifications driven by humans.
Next time, I'll be talking about another topic that's been on the to-do list for a long time: degrowth. Degrowth has become a bit of a mantra for environmentalists, but my guest has spent more than a decade pointing out the problems with this argument and promoting an interesting alternative. I aim to release that episode later this month due to missing an episode last month, so keep a lookout for that.